the first session of the afternoon, that is performance and profit of AMS. We have the great privilege and opportunity of hearing from these two great speakers. Dan Armstrong is a principal consultant at DM Consulting based in Gippsland, Victoria. And Dan is well known probably to most of you here today. He has over 20 years of experience in the dairy industry or agricultural industry more broadly, working in public and private organizations around farm systems analysis, farm business management, economics, risk, and the likes. And he's been heavily involved in the Milking Edge project, looking at the economic analysis of AMS farms. So we thank Dan for his time and collaboration and for being here with us today. And he'll be joined by Juan Gargiulo. Juan is a development officer dairy within the New South Wales DPI. And he's also been involved in the Milking Edge project basically since its beginning, because he was doing his PhD within the University of Sydney, tied up to the Milking Edge project. So Juan did a lot of the work around physical and financial performance of AMS, the comparison with conventional dairies, and developed insights into performance profit and the development of a novel tool that had been used, first developed in the world. So each of them has a short presentation that I've asked them to pull together just to kickstart that discussion, and then we'll hand over to a kind of a Q&A session with both of them. So Dan, we'll start first with yourself. If that's okay, I'll give you presenter rights now and you should be ready to go.
Juan was going to start because...
Oh, perfect. I did the wrong thing, so that's absolutely fine. So we'll flip the order because I made a mistake. So we'll flip to Juan first. So Juan, I'll make you a presenter now. And you should be ready to go.
Thanks, Nico. Can you see my screen there?
Perfectly well.
So thanks a lot for the introduction and for having me here today. So as you mentioned, what I'm going to show today is part of the research conducted as part of the Milking Edge project and my PhD. And one of the first things we realized when we started working with this project was that the adoption rates of AMS in pasture-based system was really less than 1% and really lower in comparison to confinement systems, for example, those from some European countries. So, for example, in Australia, we have now less than 1% of the farms and around 50 farms operating with AMS. So probably one of the first questions we had was if this difference was due to a lower performance of the AMS in comparison to conventional farms. So actually, what we did, the first thing we did in the project was actually the first comparison in the world for pasture-based systems that compared economic and physical performance of AMS and conventional milking systems. Previous research was done or has been conducted using assumptions and models, and this is the first that use commercial farm data. So in this case, we use 3 years of data from 2015 to 2018, and we compare 14 Australian AMS farms that at the time of the study was roughly 30% of the AMS population of the country. We collected the data using the dairy-based business methodology, and we compared these 14 farms with 100 conventional farms from the Dairy Farm Monitor project. What we did was these 100 farms were selected based on being in the same regions as the AMS farms and also having similar herd sizes, so plus minus 10% in number of cows to enable a fair comparison. So we compare multiple indicators, more than 100. Overall, what we found that physical performance on average was similar between AMS and conventional farms. For example, we compare indicators like milk production per cow, milk production per hectare, or pasture utilized per hectare. All these indicators were similar on average between both systems. We compared the profitability of both systems also, and here in this graph, I included some of the main profitability and profit indicators like EBIT, that is the earnings before interest and tax, measured as dollars per kilo of milk solids. So here we can see that both systems were similar. NS means that there were no difference between statistical difference between the systems, and the return on total assets the same. As you can see here, both indicators are low in comparison to the historical indicators. For example, the EBIT, historical EBIT from the Dairy Farm Monitor is $1.3 per kilo of milk solids, and the thing here is that these 3 years were characterized by lower income or low milk price and high cost and issues with the climatic conditions that probably affected the performance of both systems. So some of the main findings also that we found here, we found that the average income was similar between both systems. There were no differences. The feed costs, that is the main feed category, was also similar between both systems. We didn't find differences. What was really surprising for us was that labor costs, and here in labor costs we included either employed labor, that is cash paid by the farmer, and also the imputed labor, that is the family and farmer labor, were similar on average. Depreciation costs, that is the cost of the capital assets, were higher for AMS, and particularly this is due to the higher capital investment, usually for the robotic equipment. And repair and maintenance also higher for AMS. In this case, what characterized AMS is that there are some of the components are electronics and moving parts, which usually are more costly, and also they usually AMS need to commit scheduled service as part of their warranty. So normally that is not done in general by conventional farms, so probably this explains higher repairs and maintenance. Shed cost, that is a small proportion of the cost, and mainly electricity, were slightly higher for AMS, and artificial insemination and herd testing was lower for AMS. But something really interesting that we found was that when we analyzed the differences within AMS, we found that there was a large variability within AMS. For example, here I included the return on total assets, that is the main indicator of profitability, and you can see here that the different colors are different regions, and each dot is the average of one AMS. So you can see that even within a region, you can find farmers achieving 6% return on total assets and others -2 or -4%. So there's a lot of variability. And when we try to, something else that we identify here was that, for example, the labor efficiency that we mentioned that was similar on average labor cost. We found that also there was a large variability between AMS. For example, here we put 19 farms that are all the farms that participated in 5 years, and then we'll expand in the next talk about this. And the numbers of cows per labor unit. So we can see here that the average was similar between AMS and CMS, around 105 cows per FTE. But we can see here that the best farms in terms of labor efficiency spend 13% of the income in labor costs, whereas the lowest performing farms spent 34% of the income in labor costs. So the average was similar, but within AMS there was a really large variability that that kind of define why some farms were achieving high performance and others no. So after this study, we wanted to dig deeper into why some were achieving high performance, economic performance, and some others low. We kind of have a clue with some of the things that we explored in the first study, but in this case, what we did was we used all that data from 14 farms from that first study, but we included a novel data set from 28 AMS that is part of the KPI project. That is a project that we are currently running, that we are monitoring AMS all across the world. And in this case, we use data from farms from Australia, Ireland, New Zealand, and Chile. It's mostly physical data from the robot and the system performance. So we combine the economic data and the physical data, and we explore which factors, we put all the indicators in a model to try to find which were more associated with profitability. And we found actually that two were the main ones. One was the milk harvested per robot that we discussed a lot today in the morning session, and the labor, of course. This makes sense. So it's how efficient you are using the robot and the labor that you have on the farm. But actually what we found was that milk harvested per robot was the main one, the most important and the most single indicator associated with profitability. So one of the findings of this study were that, for example, we found that if farmers increased on average 100 kilos of milk harvested per robot, return on total assets increased 0.6 percentage points. So only 100 kilos makes a lot of difference in their final profitability of the farms. And also we did some simulation here, and we found that, so we explored which factors were the main one explaining higher or lower milk harvested, and we found that for pasture-based systems, the main indicator was the number of cows per robot. So that was the more important indicator that defined why some farmers were achieving high milk harvested and high profitability or lower. And here what I put is a comparison with some data that has been published from overseas, data from confinement systems, and we can see here that the differences in milk harvested per robot between both systems. So in confinement systems, they are usually achieving higher milk harvested, and today they show in Ankara that they are achieving 2,800 kilos, which is amazing. But what we found here was that the difference was between confinement and pasture-based is that overall they milk the same number of cows per robot, around 55, but the difference, of course, is mainly in the milk production per cow and the milking frequency. So confinement systems achieve higher milking frequency, and pasture-based systems lower, and that lower milking frequency is not compensated with more cows per robot in pasture-based systems, yet on average, no? But as we saw, some farmers are achieving high milk harvested and are usually they milk more cows per robot. So after conducting all these studies, we thought how we can better assess AMS or provide tools for farmers to better assess the systems, which are complex. And we started working on the development of a decision support tool for AMS, for pasture-based AMS. That actually is the first one. There were no decision tools developed for these systems to assess the impact of changes in variables. And this tool, we thought that could be really important for farmers considering AMS, because it will help them to plan better and reduce the investment uncertainty, but also for farmers that are currently operating AMS, because it will allow them to identify areas of underperformance and optimize the system. So basically, this tool uses all the data that collected across 5 years, and the data used as part of my PhD, some of the models that we developed, and I showed an overview in the previous study. And we developed a user interface, a user-friendly interface. So the tool basically is a dashboard, looks like this. So the user, the farmer, can change some indicators, for example, the number of cows in milk, and can see the impact in other indicators, such as the milking frequency, for example. The user can also set a target for milk harvested, which we saw is the main indicator, and run an optimization to see how to go from a current situation to an optimized situation in terms of milk harvested. And also the tool has the ability to compare, or as it has all this data in the background, you can enter your own figures and compare it with the commercial data that sits behind. For example, you enter your own indicator, and if it is in green, you can see that that's only achieved by top 25% of the farms in the dataset. You know, so it's backed with commercial farm data. So also what we did was we tested the accuracy of some of the predictions of the tool. And again, here we use data from overseas and Australia, from Argentina, Ireland, and New Zealand. And we tested it with 21 farms. That is the last 2 years of data from the KPI project. We found overall that the accuracy of the prediction was good, around 5–10% error in the predictions. Also, what we did was we tested the usability. So how useful and easy to use was this tool, and we tested it with 11 farmers, again from Australia, in this case, in New Zealand and Ireland. And so we gave them the tool, we explained them how to use it, and for 1 month they use it, and then they rated it with different questions. And overall, they rated this tool 4 out of 5 stars in terms of usefulness and ease of use. And we launched this tool in August this year, and as you can see, it has been used across all over the world. And at the moment, more than 350 users from 30 countries have utilized it. Also, it got the attention of the media, and it was published different articles in different magazines in Australia. So in summary, this tool is the world's first decision support available for pasture-based AMS that allows to compare and simulate the scenarios. The main characteristic probably of this is it is based on unique data collected across multiple locations and years. There's not such a comprehensive data set for AMS in the world. And of course, you can access to the tool in this link, and we would love to have your feedback and comments so we can keep improving it. So thanks very much for your time, and really happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Juan, very much for that insightful presentation. There's been a couple of questions come through. So again, following the same methodology, we'll keep them to the end for like a Q&A panel together with Dan. So we'll now move on to Dan Armstrong to hear the work around a comparison of AMS versus CMS on one farm business. So Dan, I'll go to you.
Thanks, Nico. Can you see my screen okay?
We can see your screen, but we cannot see the slides in presentation mode.
Okay.
So maybe just.
Yep. Yeah. Just go to slideshow.
You need to press.
Is that okay now?
It appears that you have 2 screens. So in that screen that you are now, I think, go to the top where it says display settings.
Yeah.
And if you can duplicate the view.
Okay.
So we are seeing the screen that has the big slide and the small little slide on the top right.
Okay, yeah. And so where do I need to go there?
If you are on that screen, on the top it says Show Taskbar on the top left. Next to it, it says Display Settings.
Oh, yeah.
If
Yeah,
you click there,
yeah.
you can press Duplicate Slideshow or Swap, whatever.
How's that?
Perfect.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thanks, Nico. And Juan, so what I'll talk about today, I guess, overlaps to some extent with what Juan has presented. It's, I guess, a 5-year study where we looked at a number of the AMS farms and looked at their data through DairyBase. And Juan sort of pulled the data out of the middle of that survey period and did some more statistical analysis on that. What I was going to present is sort of, I guess, a bit more focus on the variation and particularly look at an individual farm where they, as a case study where they had AMS and a conventional system running side by side, and that the opportunity to look at that case study sort of became apparent through the study, and it just gave such a unique opportunity to look at these two systems running side by side under the same commercial management team, and that seemed a very a very unique opportunity to get that management across the two systems as being basically the same. So I'll structure my talk a bit around the summary slide that Juan had and just try to draw out a few of the nuances of the individual farm situation. So across the data set, yeah, we did see no real statistical difference in milk price or income, but within that there was a wide range between farms, between regions, but AMS really didn't seem to be having a big impact on that. The feed costs, we see a huge range in feed costs, but again, that's it's very hard to untangle across the different regions of Australia. Any differences attributable to AMS in feed costs. So, differences due to climate and management. But this case study that we look at does give us I guess, a good opportunity to look at feed costs and pasture utilisation with the same climate, resources and management. Again, labour costs, on average weren't much different between the AMS and the conventional farms, but there's a huge range, and I think this message could be misunderstood in terms of people thinking there's no real labour savings with AMS, whereas if we look at some of the individual farms, we can see that there's substantial potential to get labour savings with AMS if it's managed with that purpose in mind. Obviously, the depreciation is pretty important with the large capital costs with AMS systems, and we'll go into that in a bit more detail. It's a cost that there's no escaping the fact that capital costs will be high, and hence the depreciation of that capital will be high with an AMS system. And we'll talk a bit more about how that high costs can be managed. Repairs and maintenance, again, can be quite high with the AMS systems and seem to change fairly significantly over the lifespan of the AMS systems. The AI and herd costs, and it's probably mostly the herd cost component of that, is significantly lower with the AMS system, but it's not really a deal breaker in terms of a cost saving, being a fairly small percentage of the total costs. And shed costs are higher, mostly due to higher power costs. And again, probably not a deal breaker given the small percentage of total costs. So I guess the big questions we were looking at were, are AMS farms more or less profitable than the conventional farms? And with the high capital costs of AMS, do the labour savings justify the investment? And then in terms of running costs, do the repairs and maintenance costs and the power costs associated with AMS make a big difference in the overall profitability? And I guess there have been questions, particularly in the early days of AMS, about would there be a negative impact on pasture utilisation with a voluntary system? So we'll delve into those questions a bit more with this case study. So yeah, as I said before, the approach we used was collecting data from any of the AMS farms that volunteered to participate over a period of 5 years, which was really good to get that extended period of time to see the changes on individual farms over time. As we, as I guess everyone would be aware that there's a significant adaptation challenge when you're going to AMS, and it can take a bit of time to find the sweet spot to operate in. And so, yeah, the comparison that we're going to look at is on Grant and Lisa Williams's farm at Hallora in Gippsland, where they've been running an AMS system side by side with a conventional rotary dairy for all of that 5-year period. So in terms of whether AMS farms are more profitable or not, you can see in each of those 5 years that the range, which is in brackets, highlights that in each of the 5 years, there was some AMS farms that were quite profitable. There was farms with getting 4, 5, 6% return on total assets. And then in the last year, the 1920 year, where it was probably really the first of those 5 years that many farms got a good combination of milk price and seasonal conditions together. And we can see in that year that there were some farms getting up around close to 10% return on total assets, which is quite, quite a high return on total assets. I think, as Juan mentioned before, the first 4 years of that study, for quite a few regions, there was either a low milk price or some fairly adverse seasonal conditions, drought and some very wet periods, but particularly drought in that period of time, and yeah, some pretty low milk prices, particularly at the start of that 5-year period. So those results, yeah, probably 4 of those years in a lot of those regions would probably have been considered reasonably tough years. So on Grant and Lisa's farm, we've got the 5 years of return on total assets for the 2 systems running side by side. And I guess in summary, overall, you would probably conclude that there's very little difference in the profitability of those 2 systems running side by side. It took quite a bit of work from Grant and Lisa to try to attribute all the costs between the 2 enterprises within the one business, and I think we made a pretty good effort to attribute costs across the 2 as accurately as we could. And yeah, I think you'll see probably the 2016-17 year was probably where the AMS farm system was probably a bit behind the rotary dairy, and that was in those early first couple of years. the building up cow numbers, the AMS system was probably operating a bit under capacity. And it was probably really only in the last 2 years where the AMS system was probably operating at a fairly optimal sort of cow numbers and milk harvested per robot. And we can see in that situation in the last 2 years, there's very little difference in the overall profitability of those two systems. Although the different cost areas were quite different between the two, the total costs came out very similar and total income almost identical. So I guess where we want to focus some of the attention is, are the labour savings enough to justify the capital cost in AMS? And I wanted to focus just a bit on that range in labour efficiency and range in labour costs per kilo of milk solids. You can see for the AMS farms, while the averages of both of those measures don't look dramatically different to the average of the conventional systems, if you look at the numbers in the brackets, which are the range, you can see there's a huge range in terms of labour efficiency in kilos of milk solids harvested per labour unit, and in the labour costs per kilo of milk solids. And I would say that that the figures at the top end of the range, for a conventional system, we'd usually say that 60,000 kilos of milk solids was very efficient for milk harvested per labour unit, whereas there's some AMS farms getting up close to 100,000 kilos of milk solids per labour unit. And there's some AMS farms that are getting down to 70 cents per kilo of milk solids and below, which is something that I haven't seen in conventional farm systems. I guess generally speaking, yeah, the average in Victoria is probably about $1.40. $1.20 is usually, anything under $1.20 is usually quite low labour costs per kilo of milk solids. And I think generally for a conventional system, if you're seeing something below $1 per kilo of milk solids nowadays, you're generally questioning whether the data is accurate or not. So getting down towards 70 cents per kilo of milk solids is certainly suggesting there's some potential for exceptionally high labour efficiency with AMS. And so in terms of comparison for Grant and Lisa's farms, the two farms, I've got that data there for the last 2 years when the AMS system was operating really efficiently. And we can see the labour costs there are about 80 cents per kilo of milk solids on the AMS farm. Whereas the Rotary farm, they're pretty close to the regional average of $1.40 per kilo of milk solids. So it appears between those two systems, we're seeing about a 60 cent per kilo of milk solids difference in labour costs, which is pretty substantial. And we're looking here at basically the same management applied across both systems. So this farm is a farm where they don't use contractors very much, do majority of their own silage, hay, cropping type work. So yeah, when you see that they're still getting labour costs per kilo of milk solids somewhere around that 80 cents per kilo of milk solids, it does suggest that there's pretty substantial potential for good labour efficiency with an AMS system. And when we look at the depreciation, as expected, the AMS farm certainly has higher depreciation costs than the Rotary farm system. We're seeing there that in the 2 years that we've focused on here, there's somewhere in the order of 40 cents to possibly down to 20 cents per kilo of milk solids difference between the two systems. So the labour savings of 60 cents per kilo of milk solids, they certainly look like they outweigh the extra depreciation costs in this system. And it was particularly noticeable in the second the last year, 1920, with the AMS system, where it was probably pretty optimal in terms of cow numbers, very good seasonal conditions, and a good milk price. They gave enough margin to feed the cows really well and achieve a bit higher per cow production, and that allowed the amount of milk harvested per robot to go a bit higher than it previously had. And in that case, they were able to dilute the depreciation costs, and it came out a bit lower per kilo of milk solids. So depreciation, it's not I guess it's not an exact science in terms of how we estimate it. We've estimated it based on an expected lifespan of 14 years for the robots, which we really haven't had many robots, you know, around that long in Australia. So we're, I guess, working on the, you know, the best estimate that we can, going on information from overseas and the little information that we have in Australia. But yeah, at the moment we've settled on, yeah, basically a 14th of the capital costs being accounted for as depreciation in each year. It's not a cost that you can do anything about in terms of management, really. But I guess the only avenue is to get the robots working efficiently in terms of milk harvested per robot and finding that sweet spot for the system that you're running. In terms of operating costs, the shed power costs were slightly higher than the rotary farm on the AMS system, and I guess, you know, it is statistically significant in terms of being higher, but in terms of the economics, it's not really that substantial and doesn't have a huge impact on the overall farm profitability. And I think we don't have the latest data from the AMS farm, but both of these farms, the solar system went in during that 1920 year and started to have a bit of an impact. The power costs on the AMS farm looked like they were starting to come down, and it appears that solar can be a pretty good match with the AMS power demand. And I guess it appears that there's a fair bit of potential to manage any downside in terms of higher electricity costs with AMS by combining it with a solar powered system. The repairs and maintenance costs are more substantial, and we seem to notice over time with the study that these seem to creep up a bit, probably as the robots get to that maybe 7-8 year old sort of stage of life, that the repairs and maintenance costs started to become more significant. And the difference between those two was yeah, in the order of 20 to possibly 40 cents per kilo of milk solids. So fairly significant, and I guess that probably needs to be a bit of a focus of the ongoing studies here, is how we manage those repairs and maintenance costs in an AMS system. What can we do to keep them manageable? What can we do to prevent them blowing out? I think that's going to be reasonably important to the long-term profitability of an AMS system. In terms of pasture utilisation, we I haven't presented a lot of the data, but we saw very little difference between the pasture consumed per hectare and the feed costs on the AMS and the CMS farm. So yeah, basically consuming about 9 tonnes of dry matter in most of the years, and getting up to about 11 tonnes of dry matter in very good seasonal conditions. And so this farm probably would be performing in terms of pasture utilisation a bit above the district average, and a little difference between AMS and conventional farms in terms of the pasture consumption or the feed costs. I guess some people do expect a big or a bit of a jump in milk production per cow when going to an AMS system. We didn't really see that in comparing these two systems. Very little difference in milk production per cow between the two systems. And if we look at it in terms of efficiency, in terms of milk solids harvested per kilo of live weight, both very similar. And particularly in that last year, looking pretty efficient in terms of how those cows were fed. So anything over 100% being considered pretty efficient in an Australian grazing system. So yeah, I guess to sum up, yeah, really nothing different in terms of milk income. In terms of feed costs and pasture utilisation, I think the thing that we can conclude probably from the Williams case study is that pasture utilisation and feed costs can be very similar in an AMS system, provided you apply good proactive pasture management in the AMS system. I think anecdotally we do see cases where an AMS system and the voluntary movement pasture management issues can blow out and have a little bit more dramatic consequences if there isn't proactive pasture management applied. But I think in the cases where good pasture management principles are applied to AMS, it doesn't need to be an issue in terms of getting good pasture utilisation. The labour costs, while on average they might look very similar between AMS and conventional systems, there is potential for some very low labour costs with an AMS system, as we've seen with Williams's system. And I get from the numbers that NABs were talking about this morning, it appears that they've also potentially got very low labour costs per unit of milk solids. Yeah, depreciation is an important issue with the AMS systems, and it appears that if you do get those labour savings, as we outlined above, that it potentially can be outweighed by, and that the depreciation costs certainly can be less than the labour savings, provided that the AMS system is operated with the objective of achieving labour efficiency, because plenty of people install them for reasons other than achieving labour efficiency. Repairs and maintenance, it is important to keep those in check, and particularly as the robots start to age a bit. There's some potential to save on herd costs, but it's not going to be a deal breaker. Potential that shed costs may increase, again, not a deal breaker, and potentially reasonably well managed if you can incorporate a solar system as well. So I guess that sums up I guess what we've been able to draw out of some of the case study farm data comparing AMS and CMS. Just wanted to thank all the farmers that contributed to that study, and yeah, I guess that's going to be a very valuable set of data to track change over time as AMS systems evolve. And yeah, particular thanks to Grant and Lisa Williams for allowing us to look at their data in a bit more detail. Thanks, Nico.
Thank you, Dan, for that, and thank you, Juan, for your presentation too at the beginning. really fantastic. If I look back, the close to 11 years that I've been in Australia working with the technology, it's come a long way, not only from the adoption, but also the understanding of performance and profits. And even 5 years ago, we didn't have all these numbers and an understanding of performance and profit. So it really, on one hand, reflects on the good willingness of those farmers, as you, Dan, mentioned just now, of putting in the data and sharing the stories, but also as an industry, getting a better insight to inform those decisions moving forward. So we now have roughly 15 minutes for like a Q&A panel, and I want to encourage all the attendees to flick questions as you've been doing so, to tackle them now in this session. The first one is that comes through is, we always get caught up between the average and the range to these kind of things. And sometimes I comment, look, at the end of the day, robotic milking is a technology, and it comes like it's how you as a manager use that tool and that yeah, to make the changes or achieve the results that you want to achieve. Do you have any reflection from either of you on your end on kind of the average performance versus that range that we see out there?
May I comment something here? But of course, it's important to analyze the average because it says a lot. But I think it's really important to understand the variability and what is possible to achieve and what is possible to achieve. And that has been mainly the focus in our study and in the tool. So, because, for example, one of the issues that we realize is that farmers, when they are trying to invest or considering investing, they might do assumptions for the calculations that might not be realistic. So it's important also to consider, rather than the average, what is likely to achieve if I do things really well, or what if I'm not doing things really well. So it's important to understand that. So I think part of the tool aims to provide that additional information that you miss when you only analyze the averages.
Yeah. And do you have any comment there?
Yeah, I think so. I think the range is really informative because, particularly with this technology where people put it in for such different reasons, and particularly if we're talking about labour efficiency with an AMS system, I guess in my view, an AMS system is a tool that has huge potential for labour efficiency, but also has a huge potential to be the biggest distraction from the fundamentals of profitable dairy farming as well. So it depends on the reasons that you put it in for. Some people put it in and really focus their attention on using it to save labour. But an AMS system, you can spend a lot of time cleaning all day. There you can generate no end of data. That's always interesting, but as I think Luke McNabb said, not always going to be informative. And I think the key is being able to work out a routine with an AMS system where you, I guess, allow the robots to do what they're designed to do in terms of taking the routine out of it and use the data to make informed decisions without being swamped by the data. And I think, in those areas, we've seen a huge difference between farms in how they've done it, and the different objectives that people have when they put it in.
Dan, with your experience, sorry, Juan, you had something to add there?
No, I was gonna say that also we have to be really careful when we analyze variables in isolation, because most of the variables interact between each other. So we have to consider those things also, rather than the average of the variability within a variable, but also that if we modify one variable, it could impact on another one. So it's a whole system that needs to be considered, I think.
Yeah, and then kind of we've always discussed with farmers and industry that there is potential in many cases to improve certain KPIs, as is the case with conventional milking too. But then the fact is, not everybody wants to run a system to the limit of pushing every single boundary, because that's not the driver. That's not the type of system that they wanna run. So that's a good one. There's a question that came through around in order to make this production system popular at a large scale, do you think the main driver should be bringing down the cost or the maintenance cost of the equipment? I think you've tapped into this in some way, but any comment there?
Do you want to repeat the question, Nico? Sorry.
So the question, I think, taps into saying, do you think the way that AMS is going to be mainstream is if it becomes, you could get in at a lower cost, or the maintenance cost are lower, or it's more flipping and looking at what are the productivity benefits and labor and production and flexibility and all those things?
Yeah, well, I think the cost difference between conventional systems and AMS systems has probably tightened over time and probably narrowed. The difference between the two has probably become less, and I think that we've also probably started to have a few more options in terms of entry, with some people entering with reconditioned second-hand AMS units, which I guess, yeah, provides, you know, a pathway where someone can enter with less capital expenditure, and I guess then we just need to monitor how repairs and maintenance costs track in those when people have taken that pathway. Yeah, so I think it's the capital cost is part of it, but it's I think it's the potential to get efficiency gains from them that dictates whether that capital cost is justified or not.
Excellent. There's another question that came through, and probably this one's targeted to you, Dan, in the sense of farmers considering investing the technology sometimes look at the changes in cost structures. For example, electricity and repairs and maintenance when moving to AMS, but they don't really have a good understanding of the current costs for their conventional kind of systems. What are your thoughts in that space of understanding the current scenario when considering an investment?
Yeah, if someone's talking to me about AMS systems, I'm always a bit nervous if they're not someone who's on top of the data for their current system, and doesn't sort of give you a sense that they'll know how to make good use of data in the future system. Because I think, like, one of the keys to running a good AMS system is being able to make use of data to make good decisions. And I think, you know, if they're not sort of demonstrating that they use data well in their current system, it always makes me a little bit nervous moving to an AMS system, because the requirement to make good use of data increases as you go to that AMS system.
Perfect. So I think it's a mixture of understanding the numbers today, that is your point, Dan, and then maybe using Juan, the tool that you mentioned, to understand and plan and look at variability of what could be expected, but really getting a good understanding of your current scenario rather than a kind of a gut feeling of perceptions. There's a question around farm working expenses, and this question comes from somebody in New Zealand. Differences between both farms, kind of, Dan, your case study, the Williams, the farm working expenses, and I think you've mentioned some of that between both farms. Is there anything else you want to add there?
No, so the total costs, if we're including depreciation, the total costs of those systems are almost identical. between the Williams's two setups. Yeah, with basically reduced labour costs balanced by increased depreciation and increased repairs and maintenance costs.
Perfect. To both of you, there's a question coming saying, in some countries overseas, there's a drive to push towards close to 1 million litres per FTE. Is there any comment here around measuring labour efficiency as litres per FTE, and what's the target?
For example, in the figure that I showed, I chose to put it in cows per FTE because it's easier to understand, but it was the same trend, so there were no differences like in terms of the farmers that were having higher cows per FTE or liters per FTE. But I'm not sure, Dan, is there any set industry target around that variable that you know?
Yeah, I guess not so much a target, but I guess it's sort of generally considered 60,000 kilos of milk solids would be pretty good performance in terms of milk solids harvested per FTE, which I think 1 million litres would probably be more like 70 to 75,000 kilos of milk solids per FTE, somewhere between 70 and 75,000. So I think, yeah, that would be, for a conventional system, that would really be pushing the limits, I would have thought. But for an AMS system, it seems to be achievable with, and some farms already well exceeding that.
Perfect, excellent. There's another question coming around numbers for indoor systems rather than pasture-based. Any comment of numbers in Australia for that we have? I can take that one if you want to.
Around which variable in particular? Any variable in particular?
Like the economic and the physical analysis. So probably the comment there is that most of it is pasture-based. Today we don't have number of indoor AMS farms as such. So yeah, most of this data relates to pasture-based AMS systems.
Yeah, and worldwide, actually, there are, as I mentioned, most of the studies comparing economics of both systems are based on models and assumptions. For example, assuming that you will save 30% of labor or whatever. And this is the only one with commercial data for pasture-based systems, and there are two more for confinement AMS that have some years already from the Netherlands. So there are not many, only 3 studies using commercial data. So really there are not many numbers to compare with.
Perfect. Look, we're on time, so I want to thank Dan and Juan again for your time and your expertise in this area. The latest Australian Dairy Farmer magazine has an article that features the Grant Williams case study that Dan mentioned before, and there's a podcast that we run within DPI called The Business of Dairy, where Juan covers a bit of this topic too. So yeah, just reach out to any of those for more information on this topic. But once again, Dan and Juan, thank you very much for your insight today.
Thank you, Nico.
No worries.